Hi everyone, it's me, Arielle, and it's Wednesday Warriors. And this week I'm going to be discussing comorbidity again. And I'm going to be looking at eating disorders and autism. And when I say autism, I'm going to be looking at different things on the autism spectrum, so I will be touching upon Asperger's as well. In the info box for this video, I'm going to put some links where you can get more information on the correlation between autism and eating disorders, specifically anorexia usually. There is a great attention to detail among people who are autistic or have other disorders on the autism spectrum. And the attention to detail that often goes along with anorexia nervosa specifically can lead people with autism to get very stuck in their eating disorder and become very fixated on certain things. And even though they may be capable of a complete recovery mindset, it's very hard for them to shift their thinking and their focus to that path. And it may be very much so, I don't want to say not their fault, but not their intention to continue down a path of anorexia or other eating disorders, but they do have a predisposition for certain thinking just because of their genetic makeup and their autistic condition. It's actually a very interesting topic, and it's one I wish I knew more about, and I did do a little bit of studying on it for this video. But again, there are a lot of new studies that are being done regarding the correlation between eating disorders and autism, and I think they're worth a look, especially if you have a child who is both autistic and has eating issues, or if you are someone who has both of those issues yourself. I do know that atypical eating is often a characteristic of especially children, but also adults who have autism. So it's not really surprising that eating disorders can manifest from certain food rituals that these individuals might engage in. There's a really great page, and it's Autism and Asperger's Syndrome, an Introduction, and it basically just gives a very well thought out introduction to autism and Asperger's. And it shows parents different signs and symptoms of the two conditions, especially for young children, so they can sort of get to the bottom of what their children's symptoms might be, because sometimes autism is not diagnosed. There's also a pretty cool page called Adults with Autism, and I'm going to post the link to that as well. They have this website that I'm referring to. It's called A Better Future for Children with Autism, Asperger's Syndrome, and Related Developmental Disorders. There's a bunch of links: education, communication, life skills, early intervention, all kinds of different resources and articles. And they do have a bunch of pages on their main page. Like I was just discussing, Autism and Asperger's, an introduction, and then there's some links for parents about handling the shock of a diagnosis and how to talk to your child with autism about their actual autism diagnosis, which I think is great. And then other pages like the one I just mentioned, Adults with Autism. They talk about causes of autism. They talk about social development, repetitive behaviors, and I think speaking about repetitive behaviors, that's where you get into some of the food rituals, also some counting, things that people may associate with anorexia nervosa or eating disorder not otherwise specified specifically among all the different eating disorders. And it's very interesting how the two can be linked. And I think it's also important to remember that obviously anorexia is not the only eating disorder out there, as we know, but even though we're talking about all these food rituals and things with counting and other sorts of high-functioning repetitive behaviors, there is an aspect where binge eating can be involved, because sometimes recognizing emotions and even signs and symptoms like hunger are very difficult for people who have autism, specifically on the higher end of the spectrum for autism. And people can perhaps just eat and continue to eat because they want to eat, or because the eating itself becomes a repetitive behavior, and they can actually overeat and have a different kind of eating disorder because of that, and that is very much so linked to their autism. The other really cool thing on this website that I wanted to share with you is that they actually have a section on the main page called Comorbid Disorders with Autism and Asperger's Syndrome. And they list, I want to say there's maybe about 15 different disorders that they talk about. And it's a really great resource for people, I think, one, to feel less alone, two, to feel more understood, and three, to maybe better understand their children or the people in their lives who may be children, teenagers, or adults. We talked last week about eating disorders and OCD and anxiety, and one of the comorbid disorders that is talked about on this website with autism and Asperger's is obsessive compulsive disorder. And I think it's very interesting when you throw that in the mix that those three things can even be linked: OCD, eating disorders, and autism. And the more things that are linked, the more challenging it is for a person to deal with all of that stuff, because just one of those things is challenging enough. But when you have all of them, it becomes really difficult, not only for the person to live with all of that stuff, but to direct their attention to the right thing at the right time, to get the best help. It might be very difficult for a person with multiple disorders or conditions to figure out the best person to treat them. It also can become a challenge when psychiatrists or psychologists or social workers or other mental health professionals are very skilled at dealing with a specific condition like autism, but not so skilled at dealing with a condition like eating disorders. So then you have to sort of split the treatment and have a worker who is very well trained in eating disorders and someone who's very well trained with autism. And, ideally, they would talk to one another and have very good communication and give the individual the best treatment. But that doesn't always happen, simply because people are experts in different fields, and it just becomes very tricky when people have multiple diagnoses. General anxiety disorder is another comorbid disorder with autism and Asperger's that is listed with its own page on this website that I'll direct you to. And it's interesting, but in addition to bipolar disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder and ADHD and all sorts of other things, specific eating disorders are not listed among these links, and certainly there are many correlations between the two. So that is one thing that I think is lacking. They do talk about gastrointestinal problems linked to autism and Asperger's, but I'm going to read you something actually from the site. When we're talking about autistic individuals and their symptoms, it's stating that atypical eating behavior occurs in about 3/4 of children with autism spectrum disorder, to the extent that it was formerly a diagnostic indicator. So if children had atypical food rituals or eating patterns, that was actually a sign that they may be autistic. That's not the case anymore, and basically selectivity is the most common problem, which means that children on the autism spectrum are only eating certain things and maybe picky eaters, but to the nth degree. This is also stating, although eating rituals and food refusal also occur, it does not appear to result in malnutrition always. And then they're talking about the GI symptoms, the gastrointestinal symptoms, and that autistic children have more or different GI symptoms than usual, but there are always, until enough research is done, there's conflicting studies with results like this. Something that's really great that's on this website is a featured article, which is going to be on your right-hand side when you're looking at the page, and it's called Strategies for Dealing with Fussy Eaters, and it's for parents, for their children who are on the autism spectrum. And while it doesn't scream eating disorder recovery or eating disorder treatment, it can be really helpful, I think, because you do have to treat autistic individuals differently as far as eating disorder treatment much of the time in order to get them to get the proper nutrition and to be successful at living as normal a life as possible. And I just sort of wanted to end with this page that I found called 10 Things an Autistic Adult Wishes You Knew. So for those of you watching this that are on the autism spectrum, I hope it speaks to your sense of self. And for those of you who are not, if you know someone who is autistic or has Asperger's, I hope that this will give you a better understanding. The first one is, I am autistic, not just an adult with autism. It's part of who I am. Basically goes on to say that since it is part of the person, that they still have thoughts and feelings and talents and are a human being like everyone else, clearly. So that part of themselves is part of who they are, and they want to be respected for that. Two is autism is a neurological variation. It's not a disease. It's not a mental illness, and it shouldn't be treated as such. I think a lot of people really do see autism as a mental illness, and certainly an eating disorder is a mental illness, but autism isn't. It's not a handicap. It is a difference in social behavior, a difference in skills, and it's something that we have to really be aware of when we maybe treating people differently. Sometimes they need different treatment, or they want different treatment, or it's necessary to give them different treatment, but that doesn't have to make them feel less human or like there's something wrong with them, because as this says, it's a variation. It's not a disability. It's not a mental illness. It just is. Number 3 is, who I am and what I am capable of is not defined by medical diagnosing criteria. I am born with my own set of abilities and difficulties, autism included. So you want to be careful not to stereotype people who have autism or are on the autism spectrum. They are still individuals. Everyone who has autism or is on the autism spectrum is not all the same, and you can't generalize and you can't make blanket statements, and you certainly can't stereotype, because everyone is still different. And just like I am not like every single woman who ever had an eating disorder and would not want to be classified that way, they don't want to be classified that way either in regards to their diagnosis. 4 is, I'm not going to be cured. And it just goes on to say that nothing is going to change the diagnosis of autism, and that would make them less of who they are, because it's part of who they are. And since it isn't a mental illness or something that someone needs to be in recovery from, the mindset really has to be different. It is part of who they are. It is part of their genetic makeup, and it is part of the way their brain functions. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. I'm just going to read you a few of the 10 things. I don't want to go into all of them, because I do hope that you'll check out this website if you're interested, and I want to leave you something to read on your own and sort of give you some food for thought. And I certainly will post the link to this awesome website, autismhelp.org. And it's been really cool because there's a lot there. So it's not just one page with a few links. There's many, many pages and resources and many, many links. And I'm not an expert on the topic of autism, so I certainly hope that you'll go there and you'll read things by people who are autistic or by people who work with those who are autistic. And I hope that you will keep researching the correlations between eating disorders and autism and those on the autism spectrum. Make sure you click on the actual link to this video today, depending upon where you're watching it, whether it's on Facebook or my website, or if you're on YouTube itself. make sure you go to that info box and you see all the links I have there, because I am going to post a lot of resources for this one. I hope you're all having a great week, and I will see you next time.